I found my daughter shivered outside on New Year's while her family laughed by the fire. The windshield wipers fought against the December snow as I turned onto Maple Grove Drive, my heart lighter than it had been in months. Sarah's favorite chocolate cake sat carefully balanced in the passenger seat, the same German chocolate recipe her mother used to make before the cancer took her 3 years ago. I'd driven 2 hours through this blizzard just to surprise my daughter on New Year's Eve, imagining the joy on her face when her old man showed up unannounced. The Hartwell mansion loomed ahead, its colonial columns draped in expensive holiday lights that probably cost more than most people's rent. My daughter had married into money, that much was clear. Richard Hartwell III came from old Connecticut wealth, the kind of family that had their names on hospital wings and country club plaques. When Sarah brought him home 2 years ago, I'd been cautiously optimistic. He seemed decent enough, if a little stiff around the edges. I parked behind a line of luxury cars, BMW, Mercedes, a Bentley that gleamed even under the streetlights. Through the frosted windows, I could see the warm glow of a grand living room, shadows moving around what looked like a roaring fireplace. Laughter drifted out into the night, the kind of hearty, wine-soaked laughter that comes from good food and better company. But as I approached the front door, cake box in hand, something made me pause. There, huddled on the wraparound porch, sat a figure in a thin sweater. My heart stopped. Sarah? My daughter looked up, and the smile that spread across her face was so forced it might as well have been painted on. Even in the dim porch light, I could see her lips were blue, her shoulders shaking from more than just the cold. Dad! What are you doing here? She jumped up quickly, wrapping her arms around herself. I was just getting some air. You know how stuffy these big family gatherings can get. But I knew my daughter. I'd raised her from the time she could barely walk, through scraped knees and broken hearts, through her mother's illness and the grief that followed. I knew when Sarah was lying, and she was lying now. Sweetheart, it's 15 degrees out here. I set the cake down and immediately shrugged off my winter coat, draping it around her shoulders. How long have you been outside? Oh, not long at all, she said, but her voice cracked slightly. That's when I saw them, tiny ice crystals on her cheeks where tears had frozen against her skin. The rage that hit me was immediate and volcanic. Someone had made my little girl cry. Someone had left her out here in the freezing cold on New Year's Eve while they stayed warm inside. Through the window, I could see her husband Richard gesturing animatedly to a group of well-dressed relatives, a brandy snifter in his hand. His mother, Eleanor Hartwell, was holding court near the fireplace, her perfectly manicured hands moving as she told what was clearly a hilarious story. The whole scene looked like something out of a Christmas card, if Christmas cards featured families who abandoned their own on the porch. Sarah, honey, what really happened? She pulled my coat tighter around her shoulders and looked away. It's nothing, Dad. Really. I said something at dinner that rubbed Eleanor the wrong way. You know how it is with in-laws. Sometimes you need to step away and let things cool down. But I'd heard the laughter from inside. If someone was cooling down, they were doing it alone. What did you say? She hesitated, glancing toward the window where her husband's family continued their celebration. I suggested that maybe this year we could spend Christmas at our apartment instead of here. You know, start our own traditions? Eleanor said that was presumptuous, that family traditions exist for a reason. Richard agreed with her, said I was being ungrateful for everything his family has given us. The picture was becoming clearer, and I didn't like what I was seeing. So they sent you outside? No, Dad, it wasn't like that. I came out here on my own. I just needed some air, needed to think. But her voice was getting smaller with each word, the way it used to when she was 7 years old and trying to convince me she hadn't broken Mom's favorite vase. Inside, someone had turned up the music. I could hear the countdown preparations beginning, someone testing a microphone, others calling for champagne. It was 11:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, it would be a new year, and my daughter was spending the final moments of this one shivering alone in the cold. I pulled her into a hug, feeling how thin she'd gotten since the wedding. You're coming inside with me right now. Dad, please don't make a scene. It'll just make things worse. Make things worse? What could be worse than this? Sarah Elizabeth, I said, using the voice that had gotten her through homework battles and teenage rebellion. No daughter of mine spends New Year's Eve frozen on a porch while her family celebrates inside. We're going in there, we're getting you warmed up, and if anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me. She looked up at me with those same green eyes that had melted my heart when she was born, and for just a moment, I saw my little girl again, not the subdued woman she'd become since marrying into the Hartwell clan. Okay, Dad? But promise me you'll be nice? I picked up the cake box and offered her my arm. I'm always nice, sweetheart. As we walked toward that front door, I made a silent promise. Whatever was happening in this house, whatever had put those frozen tears on my daughter's face, it was going to stop. I didn't know how yet, and I didn't know when, but it was going to stop. The laughter grew louder as we approached the door, and I plastered on the same fake smile I'd seen on Sarah's face moments before. Time to meet the family. The moment we stepped through the mahogany front door, the warmth hit us like a wall, not just from the blazing fireplace, but from the sudden surge of attention directed our way. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, transforming the Hartwell family from their private selves into gracious hosts. Sarah! There you are, darling! Eleanor Hartwell glided toward us, her silk dress rustling with each calculated step. She was a woman who'd clearly spent a fortune maintaining her appearance, perfectly coiffed silver hair, skin that defied her 60-something years, and jewelry that probably cost more than most people's cars. And you must be the famous father we've heard so much about. She extended a perfectly manicured hand toward me, her smile so bright it could have powered the chandelier above us. I'm Eleanor Hartwell, Richard's mother. We're absolutely delighted to finally meet you, Mr. Frank Morrison, I said, accepting her handshake and noting how she held on just a beat too long, as if she were appraising me. And thank you for having me. I hope I'm not intruding. Nonsense! Family is always welcome, she declared, though her eyes flickered briefly to Sarah's still shivering form. Sarah, dear, why don't you go freshen up? You look a bit windblown. It was a dismissal disguised as concern, and I watched my daughter's shoulders slump slightly as she nodded. Of course. Dad, let me take your coat. I'll get that. Richard appeared suddenly, his politician's smile firmly in place. My son-in-law was exactly what Central Casting would order for. Wealthy Connecticut air. Tall, square-jawed, with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money. Frank. Great to see you again. Come, let me introduce you to everyone. As Sarah disappeared upstairs, Richard guided me toward the living room where a dozen or so family members and friends had gathered. The room screamed old money, Persian rugs, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, and enough crystal to stock a small store. Everyone, this is Sarah's father, Frank Morrison, Richard announced. Frank's a contractor up in Hartford. Works with his hands, builds things that last. Very admirable, blue-collar work. The way he said, blue-collar, made it sound like an exotic species he'd read about but never actually encountered. How wonderful, said a man who introduced himself as Richard's uncle, Charles Hartwell. We need more people who actually make things in this country. Richard here has been telling us about the family business, Hartwell Dynamics. Perhaps you've heard of us? I had heard of them, all right. More than they could possibly imagine. Can't say that I have. I lied smoothly. What kind of business? Oh, manufacturing, logistics, some government contracts. Eleanor waved her hand dismissively. Terribly boring stuff, really. Though we've been blessed with tremendous success. We've expanded into 3 new markets just this year alone. Charles nodded enthusiastically. The defense contract we landed in October was particularly lucrative. Our silent partner has been invaluable, wonderful man, though terribly mysterious. Never even met him face to face. All business through intermediaries. I sipped the brandy Richard had pressed into my hand and made appropriate noises of interest, all while a cold satisfaction settled in my chest. These people had no idea they were bragging to the very man who'd made their recent success possible. Sarah's so fortunate, Eleanor continued, settling into her throne-like chair near the fireplace. Richard could have married anyone. There were several lovely girls from excellent families practically throwing themselves at him. But he chose our dear Sarah. Sometimes love makes us generous in our choices. The backhanded compliment hung in the air like smoke. Around the room, I caught subtle nods and knowing glances. This was clearly a familiar theme. Where is Sarah, anyway? Charles asked, looking around. Shouldn't she be helping serve? The caterers left hours ago. I'll find her, Richard said, but made no move to actually do so. Oh, let her rest, Eleanor said with false magnanimity. The poor dear has been so busy lately. Although, Frank, you might mention to her that she should consider taking some cooking classes. Richard does love a home-cooked meal, and Sarah's attempts are. Well, bless her heart. Laughter rippled through the group, and I felt my jaw clench. These people were talking about my daughter like she was a charity case they'd graciously taken in. She's always been a wonderful cook, I said quietly. Her mother taught her well. Oh yes, of course. Eleanor's voice dripped with sympathy. Such a tragedy, losing her mother so young. Sarah mentioned she was. What was it? A teacher? A professor, I corrected. Literature at Hartford University. How nice, she said in a tone that suggested it was anything but. Sarah reappeared then, having changed into a dress that looked expensive but somehow seemed to diminish rather than flatter her. She moved quietly to the kitchen and returned with a tray of appetizers, serving everyone with the practiced invisibility of hired help. As I watched my daughter, my brilliant, funny, beautiful daughter, being treated like a servant in her own home, something crystallized inside me. These people had everything they wanted because of money I'd provided, and they were using that security to crush the spirit of the person I loved most in the world. The countdown to midnight had begun on the television, but all I could think about was a different kind of countdown, one that would end with the Hartwells learning exactly who they'd been taking for granted. At 11:58 p.m., I set down my barely touched brandy and found Sarah in the kitchen, mechanically loading the dishwasher while her family's laughter echoed from the living room. She looked up when I entered, and I saw something in her eyes that broke my heart, a dullness that hadn't been there before her marriage. I should get going before the roads get worse, I said softly. Of course, Dad. Thank you for coming. She dried her hands on a dish towel, her movements careful and controlled. And thank you for the cake. I'll save it for later. I pulled her into a hug, holding her longer and tighter than usual. She felt so fragile in my arms, like she might break if I squeezed too hard. When I pulled back, I cupped her face in my hands the way I used to when she was small and needed reassurance. Stay strong, sweetheart, I whispered, making sure my voice carried all the love and promise I could manage. Things are going to get better. I promise you that. Her eyes filled with tears she was too well trained to let fall. I love you, Dad. I love you too, baby girl. More than you'll ever know. Richard appeared in the doorway, checking his expensive watch. Leaving before midnight? That's too bad, Frank. We were just about to pop the champagne. Another time, I said, shaking his hand and noting how he barely looked at his wife. Thank you for the hospitality. Of course. Family is everything to the Hartwells. Drive safe now. Family is everything. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so cruel. The snow had intensified during my visit, turning the world into a white blur beyond my headlights. I drove slowly, partly because of the conditions but mostly because I needed time to think. Every mile that passed brought more clarity to what I'd witnessed tonight. My daughter's hollow eyes. Eleanor's casual cruelty. The way they'd spoken about Sarah like she was an inconvenience they tolerated out of obligation. The sight of her serving them like hired help while they lounged by the fire she wasn't welcome to join. By the time I reached the Hartford city limits, my grief had crystallized into something harder and more focused. The Hartwells had made a fundamental mistake tonight. They'd shown me exactly who they were when they thought no one important was watching. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the truck for a moment, looking at my modest two-story house. The neighbors probably saw exactly what the Hartwells saw, a widowed contractor living quietly, making ends meet with honest work. The house needed paint, the driveway needed repaving, and I drove a 10-year-old pickup truck that had seen better days. It was a carefully maintained illusion. Inside, I poured myself a Real drink, not the expensive brandy the Hartwells favored, but good Kentucky bourbon, and settled into my home office. The room the Hartwells would never see, where the real Frank Morrison conducted his business. My computer came to life, revealing a financial portfolio that would have made Richard's Uncle Charles weep with envy. 25 years of careful investing, started with the life insurance money from my wife's death and built through shrewd real estate deals and strategic stock purchases. When other contractors were buying bigger trucks and flashier equipment, I'd been buying undervalued properties and dividend stocks. I'd learned early that people saw what they expected to see. A contractor who lived modestly was exactly that, a contractor. They never looked deeper, never wondered if maybe that contractor had been quietly building wealth while they were busy flashing theirs. The irony was delicious. 3 years ago, when Hartwell Dynamics was struggling to secure financing for their expansion, my investment firm, Morrison Capital Holdings, had stepped in as a silent partner. I'd provided the capital that saved their business, all while they had no idea their daughter-in-law's blue-collar father was the man keeping their lifestyle afloat. I opened the Hartwell Dynamics file and studied the numbers. I owned 38% of their company through various shell corporations and holding companies. Not quite a controlling interest, but close enough to cause serious damage if I chose to. And after tonight, I was definitely choosing to. But this wouldn't be about destroying them out of spite. That would be messy, emotional, and ultimately unsatisfying. No, this would be surgical. Precise. I would take apart their world piece by piece, the same way they'd been dismantling my daughter's spirit. They thought they were untouchable, protected by old money and older connections. What they didn't understand was that new money, smart money, could be far more dangerous than anything their ancestors had built. I pulled up my contact list and began making notes. Board members who owed me favors. Suppliers who valued my business more than theirs. Contractors who'd been waiting years for the kind of opportunities one could provide. The Hartwells had spent tonight showing me how little they valued Sarah. Tomorrow, I'd begin showing them exactly what that mistake was going to cost them. I raised my bourbon toward the window, toward the direction of that mansion where my daughter was probably lying awake next to a man who didn't deserve her. "Happy New Year, sweetheart," I whispered. "Daddy's going to make everything right." The planning began immediately. January passed in a blur of carefully orchestrated phone calls and strategic meetings. While the Hartwells celebrated their New Year's success, I worked methodically to dismantle the very foundation of their arrogance. My first call was to David Chin, CEO of Pacific Defense Solutions. We'd done business together for 5 years, and I'd helped him secure 3 major contracts when his company was struggling. "Frank, good to hear from you." David's voice was warm through the phone. "What can I do for you?" "That Hartwell Dynamics contract you've been considering for the Nevada project," I said, cutting straight to business. "I'd recommend looking elsewhere." There was a pause. "Any particular reason?" "Quality concerns. Reliability issues. You know how it is, sometimes companies get too comfortable, start cutting corners." David didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. In our business, reputation was everything, and my word carried weight. "I'll have my team revisit our options. Thanks for the heads up." 1 contract gone. 7 more to follow that week. The second week of January, I called Thomas Brennan, who controlled the largest logistics network on the East Coast. Tom owed me more than money. I'd co-signed a loan for him when no bank would touch his startup 15 years ago. "I need a favor, Tom." "Name it, Frank." "You know I'm good for it." "Hartwell Dynamics. Any shipping contracts you have with them, I need them discontinued." "Consider it done." "Supply chain issues, right?" "These things happen." By the end of that conversation, Hartwell Dynamics had lost their primary shipping partner and would be scrambling to find alternatives at triple the cost. The third week brought a visit to my lawyer's office in downtown Hartford. Margaret Walsh had been handling my legal affairs since my wife's death, and she'd helped structure Morrison Capital Holdings to be virtually invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. "I want to establish a trust," I told her, sliding a folder across her desk. "Beneficiary is my daughter, Sarah Morrison Hartwell. I want every asset I'm about to liquidate from certain investments to flow directly into this trust." Margaret reviewed the documents with the thoroughness that made her worth her considerable fees. "This is a substantial amount, Frank. You're talking about millions." "That's correct. And you want Sarah to have access to the principal immediately?" "I want her to have independence immediately. Full access, but structured so that even if she divorces, her husband can't touch a penny." Margaret smiled. "Now that's what I call protective planning. I'll have this drafted by Friday." While I worked behind the scenes, I made sure to check on Sarah regularly. Each visit to their apartment confirmed what I already knew: the Hartwells were still treating my daughter like an unwelcome guest in her own life. "Oh, hello, Frank," Richard said when he answered the door one evening in late January. He was dressed for what looked like a business dinner, while Sarah sat at their small kitchen table grading papers. She'd taken a part-time teaching position at a local community college, probably because the Hartwells made her feel like she needed to contribute financially. "Just dropping off Sarah's birthday gift," I said, holding up a small wrapped package. "Her birthday's not for 2 weeks," Richard said, checking his watch impatiently. "I know. I'll be out of town on business." Another lie, but a useful one. Sarah looked up from her papers, and I was relieved to see a genuine smile cross her face. "Dad! You didn't have to." "Of course I did. What kind of father would I be if I missed my little girl's birthday?" Richard was already putting on his coat. "Sarah, I'm meeting the investors at the club. Don't wait up." He left without kissing her goodbye, without asking about her day, without any acknowledgement that she existed beyond her utility as a housewife. After he was gone, Sarah and I sat together while she opened her gift, a simple silver locket that had belonged to her mother. "It's beautiful, Dad," she said, her fingers tracing the delicate engraving. "Your mother wanted you to have it when you got married, but I'd been saving it, waiting for the right moment. I think she would want you to have it now. How are things with Richard's family?" I asked carefully. Sarah's smile faltered slightly. "They're fine. Eleanor thinks I should quit teaching. She says it reflects poorly on Richard to have his wife working at a community college instead of volunteering for the right charities. And what do you think? I love teaching, Dad. These kids, they remind me why literature matters. But maybe Eleanor's right. Maybe I should be focusing more on being a proper wife." The resignation in her voice made my chest tight with anger, but I kept my expression neutral. "Your mother was a professor her entire career, even after she married me. She never stopped being who she was. That was different." "No, sweetheart. It wasn't different at all. I left that night more determined than ever. While I'd been systematically dismantling their business empire, the Hartwells had continued their assault on my daughter's spirit. The symmetry was perfect. As their world contracted, hers would expand. By February 1st, Hartwell Dynamics had lost 6 major contracts, their primary shipping partner, and their backup financing had mysteriously dried up. The board members I'd cultivated over the years were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about management decisions and future viability. And through it all, the Hartwells remained blissfully unaware that their silent partner, their salvation, had become their destroyer. The stage was set for the reckoning. By March, the cracks in the Hartwell empire had become chasms. I watched from a distance as their carefully constructed world began to crumble, each domino falling exactly as I'd planned. Richard started coming home later and later, his politician's smile replaced by the haggard look of a man watching his inheritance disappear. Eleanor's weekly dinner invitations to Sarah stopped entirely, apparently. Having a daughter-in-law whose father was just a contractor became less charming when the family fortune was hemorrhaging money. The call I'd been waiting for came on a gray Thursday in early April. "Mr. Morrison?" The voice was crisp, professional. "This is Janet Mills from Hartwell Dynamics. We're convening an emergency shareholder meeting next Tuesday, and as a significant stakeholder, your presence is requested." I let a moment of silence stretch before responding. "Of course. I'll be there." "Excellent. The meeting is at 10 a.m. at our corporate headquarters." Mr. Hartwell asked me to mention that they're very much looking forward to finally meeting you in person. I'm sure they were. The Hartwell Dynamics headquarters was a gleaming glass tower in downtown Hartford, the kind of building designed to intimidate. I'd driven past it countless times over the years, knowing that my money had helped pay for its marble lobby and imported fixtures. I dressed carefully that morning, my best suit, the one I'd worn to Sarah's wedding. Conservative, understated, the kind of outfit that suggested success without flaunting it. When I looked in the mirror, I saw exactly what I wanted to see, a man who belonged in that boardroom. The conference room on the 20th floor buzzed with nervous energy. The entire Hartwell clan was there: Richard, Eleanor, Uncle Charles, and half a dozen other family members I'd met at various social functions. Board members filled the remaining seats, their faces grave. I took a seat at the back, saying nothing as the meeting began. Richard stood at the head of the polished conference table, his usual confidence replaced by barely controlled desperation. Financial charts and graphs covered the wall-mounted screens, each one telling the same story: Hartwell Dynamics was dying. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice strained, "I won't sugarcoat our situation. We've lost 60% of our major contracts in the past 3 months. Our primary logistics partners have terminated their agreements. Our credit lines have been frozen, and our suppliers are demanding payment up front." Eleanor sat rigid in her chair, her perfectly composed mask finally showing cracks. "This has to be sabotage," she said, her voice sharp. "Companies don't just collapse overnight without cause. We've hired investigators," Charles added, loosening his tie. "Someone is systematically targeting our business relationships. But we can't identify who or why." A board member I didn't recognize leaned forward. "What about our silent partner? Surely Morrison Capital Holdings would step in to protect their investment?" The room fell silent. I could see Richard's jaw working as he struggled with words he clearly didn't want to say. We've been unable to reach our partners at Morrison Capital," he admitted finally. "All communications have gone unanswered for the past 6 weeks." "Unanswered?" Eleanor's voice rose an octave. "That's impossible. They have 38% stake in this company. Which brings us to why we're here," Richard continued, his hands trembling slightly as he shuffled his papers. "We need to identify our silent partner. We need to bring them to the table and negotiate a rescue package, or—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Or we lose everything," Charles finished grimly. That's when I stood up. The movement was subtle, but every head in the room turned toward me. I walked slowly to the front of the room, my footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent space. "You don't need to identify your silent partner," I said quietly, stopping directly in front of Richard. "He's been here the whole time." The confusion on their faces was almost comical. Richard looked at me blankly, as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. "I'm sorry, Frank, but this is a closed meeting for shareholders and board members," Richard began. "I am a shareholder," I interrupted. "I'm Morrison Capital Holdings. I'm your silent partner. And as of this morning, I've liquidated every single one of my holdings in Hartwell Dynamics." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as understanding dawned on their faces, followed immediately by disbelief, then horror. Eleanor was the first to find her voice. That's impossible. You're a contractor. You live in that little house." "I live modestly by choice," I said calmly. "Just like I invested in your company by choice. And just like I chose to destroy it." "But why?" Richard's voice was barely a whisper. "We welcomed you into our family. You left my daughter shivering on your porch on New Year's Eve while you laughed by the fire. I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room. You treated her like a servant in her own home. You made her feel like she wasn't good enough for your precious family name. The memory of that night, Sarah's frozen tears, their casual cruelty, sharpened my focus. You built your empire on my money, and you used that security to crush the spirit of the person I love most in this world. I looked directly at Eleanor, then at Richard. You laughed by the fire while she froze. Now feel the chill yourselves. I turned and walked toward the door, leaving them in stunned silence. The assets I've removed from your company have been placed in trust for Sarah, I said without turning around. She'll never need your approval, your money, or your fake hospitality again. The door closed behind me with a soft click, sealing their fate. The Hartwell empire didn't just crumble, it collapsed with the spectacular finality of a controlled demolition. Within 6 months of that boardroom meeting, everything they'd taken for granted was gone. The mansion on Maple Grove Drive went first, sold to cover debts that multiplied faster than they could count them. I drove past it one evening in late summer and saw a foreclosure sign planted in the same manicured lawn where I'd found Sarah shivering 8 months earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me. Richard's Bentley disappeared next, followed by Eleanor's Mercedes. Uncle Charles lost his country club membership when he couldn't pay the dues. The family name that had opened doors for 3 generations suddenly became a liability, whispered about in boardrooms and social circles as a cautionary tale about overextension and poor judgment. Richard and Sarah's marriage didn't survive the financial collapse. Not because of the money, Sarah had never cared about that, but because the stress revealed who Richard really was when the props of privilege were stripped away. He became bitter, angry, looking for someone to blame for his family's fall from grace. That someone, predictably, was Sarah. If I hadn't married you, none of this would have happened. He'd screamed at her one night in July, his voice carrying through the thin walls of the modest apartment they'd been forced to move into. Your father destroyed everything out of spite. Sarah had called me that night, her voice small and shaky. Dad, I think I need to come home. You already are home, sweetheart, I told her. Check your email. The house I'd bought for her was nothing like the Hartwell mansion, no marble columns or grand staircases. But it was hers, completely and legally, purchased with funds from the trust I'd established. A charming Victorian on a quiet street in West Hartford, with a wraparound porch, a garden she could tend, and most importantly, a fireplace that would never exclude her. By September, Sarah had filed for divorce. By October, she'd moved into her new house. By November, I watched her plant tulip bulbs in her front yard, her face bright with something I hadn't seen in 2 years: hope. Richard had tried to contest the divorce settlement, of course. His lawyers demanded half of marital assets, not understanding that Sarah's trust fund had been established before their marriage and was completely protected from his claims. Eleanor hired private investigators to try to prove fraud or manipulation, but Margaret Walsh had structured everything perfectly. Every transaction was legal, every document properly filed. The Hartwells had no recourse except to accept what they'd never had to face before: consequences. On New Year's Eve, exactly 1 year after that horrible night on their porch, I found myself in Sarah's living room, helping her arrange logs in her fireplace. She'd invited a few friends from the community college where she now taught full-time, real friends who valued her for her mind and her heart, not her utility or her connections. I think that should do it, she said, stepping back to admire our handiwork. She was wearing jeans and a soft sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked younger than she had in years, like the daughter I remembered from before the Hartwells had tried to reshape her into their image of acceptability. The fire caught quickly, flames dancing cheerfully in the hearth. Sarah settled onto the couch beside me, tucking her feet under her like she used to do as a child during our movie nights. Dad, she said quietly, watching the flames, I know what you did. I kept my expression neutral. I don't know what you mean. Morrison Capital Holdings. The trust fund. The way Richard's family lost everything right after you met them. She turned to look at me, her green eyes bright with understanding. You destroyed them for me. There was no point in denying it. They hurt you. They did, she agreed. But you know what? I think I needed to see who they really were. Who Richard really was. If things hadn't happened the way they did, I might have spent years trying to be someone I'm not, trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it. Outside, we could hear fireworks beginning in the distance. Midnight was approaching, and with it, another new year. Do you regret it? I asked. Sarah considered the question seriously. The marriage? Yes. But not because of what I lost. Because of what I almost let them take from me. She reached over and squeezed my hand. You gave me myself back, Dad. You gave me freedom. As the countdown began on her television, I realized that revenge had never really been the point. Destruction had just been the necessary first step. What mattered was what came after. Sarah's laughter filling this warm room, her confidence returning day by day, her future stretching ahead without anyone else's limitations defining it. 10, 9, 8, the crowd on TV chanted. 7, 6, 5. Sarah joined in, grinning at me. 4, 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year! As fireworks exploded across the screen and Sarah hugged me tight, I understood something I hadn't quite grasped a year ago. Revenge wasn't about destruction alone, it was about balance. About ensuring that cruelty had consequences and kindness had rewards. Sometimes karma just needs a silent hand to guide it. And sometimes, the best revenge is simply giving the people you love the life they deserve.